but I hope to reveal it towards the end. The surfing raccoons, maybe you can guess where that's coming from. So I'm Roman Biek. I was a postdoc in Melissa's lab from 2004 to 2007. And I want to start by saying lots of thanks to Katja, Nicole, and Jaap for organising this. I think it's been a fantastic idea. Really glad to be here. Really enjoyed the morning so far. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this and to talk about my experience of working as a postdoc with Les. So it's a slightly different perspective, I guess, from what you've heard so far. Obviously, we already heard when you talk about Les as the scientist, you also have to talk about Les as the human being, or the Renaissance man, as he has been referred to. So there will be a little bit of that. So I first knew or heard about Les when I was a PhD student. I was studying disease ecology at the University of Montana with Mary Poss, trying to understand how we can use virus evolution and molecular evolution data to understand disease ecology processes, and I was studying lentiviruses, FIV, in mountain lions. And I looked at great envy and with fascination at the work that Les was doing on rabies at the time. So the papers that he had come out, doing really elegant stuff with the tremendous amount of data that he was talking to earlier, revealing with elegant mathematical models kind of the dynamics of rabies in space and time. And then there was also Andy Dobson's commentary, which I think was very inspiring. He sort of, you were bashing him for kind of not appreciating the influence of space in disease ecology, but actually he kind of weaved together everything from the history of infectious disease ecology with rabies, and the presidency of Jimmy Carter being responsible for raccoon rabies. And Walt Disney and Brian Grenfell were in there as well. So it was really a great commentary, and it made me feel like this was an exciting area to be in. This was a great lab to join. I really thought it would be fantastic to work with Les. And that was because in my system I felt like we really had to struggle to find the right samples. I was constantly chasing people to give me samples of mountain lions, maybe not the easiest creature to study in that respect. But obviously Les had access to this tremendous amount of data because rabies was a notifiable disease. There were thousands of cases each year. But what I felt was missing from the work so far was the molecular perspective, molecular evolution and genetics. And so I decided that this is really what I wanted to do. I wanted to contact Les, and I honestly can't remember whether I contacted you first or you put out your job ad first, but clearly Les had arrived at the same conclusion, and he already had an NIH grant to fund exactly that type of work. And long story short, so I came for an interview and I got the job, and it was what I intended to do, and I think it was also what he had hoped to be doing for quite some time. So we're hoping to kind of extend this, adding the molecular evolution perspective to the work that they had been doing, looking at spatial temporal dynamics, even looking at predictive models, and now adding the genetics into the picture. So I arrived in 2004 in October and left in June 2007, so I was here for a little bit less than 3 years, but it was a very productive time. So we had 8 papers that we published together during that period. It was not so much the number of papers or so per se. I looked at that recently, so 6 out of these 8 were cited about 100 times or more, some more than that. So it was a productive time and quite formative in terms of my own career. I went on to get a permanent position after that, which is always a great thing. And it definitely set me up in very nicely for a range of different work. So I don't want to talk about the details of the research per se, but I just want to share maybe a few stories that I think are quite telling. So I was really intrigued by the possibility of working on rabies because of this access to data and samples. And I came here and I remember sitting down with Les and dreaming up sort of like what the study would look like, and having this impression that what we would be doing is well, basically going through spreadsheets and of thousands of samples, and because all these rabies samples are reported, sent to CDC, they're confirmed, and we can just pick the ones that we want for our study, right? So that's what we had envisioned, and when I arrived here, I realized, though, it quickly became clear that that's not really how it works. these state labs that report rabies are not paid to store these samples. They don't have money to keep samples in freezers. And rightfully so. I mean, they really have different priorities. So it turned out that what I thought was hundreds and thousands of samples to work with were a lot fewer, and we actually worked really hard to get the samples together. And I'm going to put Les on the spot. So how many samples did we have in the end, Les?
It was 89, or 84.
It was 48, Les.
84, 48.
Close enough. So it was enough to get a great paper out, but it was cutting it, sailing quite close to the wind, I think, in many ways. And I think I'll come back to that at a later point. So this was the paper anyway. I don't want to talk much more about it. But maybe I just want to sort of quickly summarize. But so we did this work on rabies, and because we had to wait for these samples to come through to actually find the last little bits sort of at the bottom of some people's freezer, we also started working on Ebola, and that was another sort of fortuitous thing. I think at the time Peter Walsh had presented data to Les that showed that Ebola had these strange spatial temporal patterns, and to Les we'd been staring at these rabies data for years. It was clear this is an expansion wave, and I guess it's a case of if you hold a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, or at least you will recognize a nail when you see it. And so there was the wave-like expansion of Ebola. I'm not sure if you're still holding on to that hammer nowadays. I think I've kind of buried that hammer a little bit. Peter Walsh is still holding on to it. But yeah, so we worked on these papers, but I want to talk about maybe some sort of broader lessons that I thought sort of had come out of this work, and where I think it's kind of left maybe a little bit of an imprint. So I think that the first one is, and this was actually the first rabies paper we worked on together, is about genetic population structure being obviously the combination of neutral and adaptive processes. And that might not sound very surprising to an evolutionary ecologist, but I think for many people working with infectious disease data and who generated virus sequence data, that was not maybe so obvious. And the fact that we shouldn't necessarily, just because we see genetic variation in space, we should try to attach the adaptive story to it unless we have reason to do so, and unless we can reject like a neutral evolution as a null hypothesis. So that was some of the first things we did with the raccoon, well actually with fox rabies data from Canada. And I think that was also important sort of as a realization that this neutral evolution was really what made a lot of the other things we were interested in possible. So everything from molecular clocks to coalescent and demographic inference, all of this was happening on the back of neutral evolution. So that was sort of an important insight. The other one was that these population dynamic processes, such as an expansion wave, these big rabies outbreaks, for example, this one big rabies outbreak, an expansion wave, leaves a strong and discernible signature in molecular data. And this was just a few years after Ryan's seminal paper on phylogenetic, where they had coined the frame and kind of asked for a new field, sort of merging molecular and epidemiological models, and to understand how we can basically get new insights from bringing together these different fields. And I think with our rabies model, we were able to kind of show how in natural systems very much the merging of these different data can lead to new insights and contribute to understanding of phylogenetic, and in particular to incorporate spatial information, so location data, which basically laid the groundwork for what we now do with pathogen phylogeography, and especially with measurably evolving pathogens. And then also, more generally, once we know that we can describe so like the path in space and in time based on the phylogeographic patterns, we can also ask how landscape heterogeneity, spatial heterogeneity influences this, which kind of leads to the landscape genetics of measurably evolving pathogens. And so it's on these themes that I've continued to work, and so I just want to kind of highlight a few things that I do nowadays that kind of go back to that period. Not all of what I work on is rabies, but there's some work that I do with colleagues at Glasgow where we look at landscape genetics of canine rabies in Africa. So we're interested in the and basically how the physical landscape influences pathogen spread, and so identifying factors that either facilitate or inhibit infectious disease spread. And here we find that with dog rabies roads and dog presence rather than dog density are important, which has implications for how we design control strategies and vaccination strategies. And then we also continue, actually this is work that still involves Les, where we continue on the raccoon rabies work together with Susan Nathan Davis and others. So this is work by a former postdoc, Hannah Truby, where we're asking not how landscape heterogeneity affects the permeability of the landscape to spread, but rather the contribution that different habitat or different types of habitat are making to the persistence. And so she first used simulations to show that from pathogen phylogenetic data we would be able to discern these different contributions, so that habitats that are more important, that are more productive in terms of producing new infections, that we can identify what those habitats are. And we're currently applying that to empirical data. So this is from New York, the samples, and this is the phylogeographic representation of it, where we have essentially the branches now projected in space. And then finally, again working with rabies, but in a sort of different setting or a different type of question. We're asking how viruses can move to a novel host, what it takes to establish a novel host. Les and I had always discussed how it would be great to do experiments, but that rabies is one of the worst systems to do experiments in part because these experiments are quite horrific. But it turns out that some people have done these kind of cross-infection experiments in the past and have published them, but not really put them together. So a student of mine has done a meta-analysis of these cross-infection experiments and tried to identify what predicts how well a virus can establish in a novel host. And he found, in addition to kind of expected effects like phylogenetic distance, that host body temperature actually is an important predictor of that and kind of modulates whether or not the virus changes the incubation period, which I think is a major predictor of establishment. But this is kind of like the science sort of legacy that I took with me from working with Les. There's also sort of some more general stories that, or insights that I think I wanted to share. So I tried to come up with a few. And one of them, Les actually asked me, so what do you think, are you going to take away from working with me? What have you learned while you were here? And I remember we had this conversation. Do you remember what it was?
No.
Right. So my first response was, well, Les, I really think from working with you, I understand the value of telling a story. And I think Les is a great storyteller, and you can see it when he gave his talk earlier, and you can see it in his other talks. And I think being able to capture the audience imagination and sort of having the right cues and images and all that is something that is really a great skill to have as a scientist. And I'm not claiming that I've managed that skill, but being aware of it is, I guess, the first step. So in that sense, I was a bit surprised that Les was actually able to talk about raccoon rabies without one of the key elements that he always had, one of the key stories about explaining long-distance dispersal and how it comes about. So what is the key to long-distance dispersal in raccoons?
Garbage trucks.
Exactly. So where is the raccoon rabies? Where would we be without the garbage trucks? And I was very relieved to see that actually there is images that validate that story somewhat, which I hadn't seen before. So a recent find. Okay, so other lessons that I've learned from being here. Well, I remember actually I wrote one grant while working with Les, and I didn't get funded, but I was quite anxious about describing the experiments and thinking ahead of kind of like what exactly we were going to do. And at some point I remember Les saying, well, you know what Frank Lloyd Wright, the great architect, what he said about the first rule of architecture? Get the contract. So, and that really stuck with me because, I mean, obviously, there's a fine line between promising things that you can't keep, and I want to come back to the 48 samples out of the thousands. But on the other hand, it's also, of course, science does develop, and at some point you have to trust that you can deliver something interesting on the back of interesting work you've done before, and if you can show that, then maybe you will succeed and convince your funders. But the Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, is also a nice transition into something that other people have mentioned as well, and that obviously Les is interested in much more than just science, and so one of the most what made it a great experience was not just the work that we did together, but also sort of having all this input and the variety of other things we can draw from in life to excite us, and so that was a great thing being around Les. I have to say, I came in sort of after the furniture making and pot making phase, but and I came before the boat making period. But I was at the height of the Italian frenzy. So during that period, it was very difficult to have conversations with Les without sort of diverting into some aspect of Italian culture, or English, or even sort of switching from English into Italian. And sometimes that can be distracting. I mean, you're a young postdoc, you want to share your latest findings, and all of a sudden you're starting to talk about Renaissance paintings, and it's like, And there's another thing about Les that I remember from that, and I don't know if other people had that experience, but he has a knack for some of the most obnoxious ringtones on his cell phone. Did other people notice that? And at the time, it was, yes. And at the time, it was Italian opera. So there were lots of conversations that were broken up by these kind of ringtones. But of course, Italy was a great a love of his that he cared a lot about, and that also involves food. And when I talk about food, I think it's not about eating, and that's what you have to really have to understand. When we talk about food, there's a lot more involved, and that's why I want to mention it. So I think Les has a great appreciation for sort of artisan culture of producing things with your hand, and he has sort of mastered a lot of things himself, and sort of during that period he was also interested in sort of making his own bread, making pasta and all that thing. But it's not just about food, it's also about the ingredients, the attention to detail, and bringing in people to share the food with. And so food becomes kind of the vehicle to create community, and that's something that was very important to Les and to Didi, and I think that really was also a very important aspect of their life. And it kind of led to their home being kind of like a place where they love having people around, they love inviting people and creating that sense of community, whether it's through food or to watching movies or discussing books or listening to music. So that's another thing that I really take away from staying here, that was very enriching in that sense, and to be part of that. And it also made a particular difference to me because it was not only formative years in terms of the scientific work, but a year after getting here I also married my long-term girlfriend, Sandra, and a year later our son Liam was born. And being away from our parents, the closest people we had were Les and Didi, so they were part of that experience as well. And so it was great to share that with them, and to see their excitement about having a child. And of course also Les being a great photographer, it meant that some of the images owed to him that document that very important period of our life. And that then brings me to Les as a photographer. So that was another thing that was really important to him during the time. So if he wasn't talking about Italy and Italian culture and language, he was talking about his photography. So that was the other distraction from the science he had to deal with. But also, it was very impressive to see how, in a very short period of time, he created a lot of really striking images of the American Southwest and the Colorado Plateau, as we heard, as sort of one of the areas that he was really interested in. And so I'm sure many of you have seen this book or have seen his images. But it also, to me, feels like a really good way of summarizing, no less in many ways, because I think even though he's very eclectic in his interests and obviously has so many different things both in his research career as well as in his personal life that he has pursued, but I think in many ways he often comes back to sort of like the same things, or they are common threads, I feel, in this. And some of this is sort of coming back to the basics and the fundamentals and being interested in the things that are left once you strip down a lot of the ornament and then the superfluous. And I think that really comes through in his landscape photography. And I don't know, I'm sure you wrote poetry at some point, but I don't have any, right, okay. I don't have any of Les's poems, but I thought this would be an appropriate one to match to his photography. So this is a Zen poem, and in Zen, a lot of these things of coming back to the fundamentals of the basics of life, as well as concepts of non-duality and impermanence. All of that is part of Zen Buddhism. And so in this poem, it says, "In our lifetime, false and true, good and bad are confused. While playing with the moon, scorning winds and listening to birds, for many years I merely saw the mountains had snow, and this winter I suddenly realized that snow completes mountains." And I put this up there because one of the other things that I found out that Les and I had in common was that he had a long-standing interest in Zen Buddhism, as I did myself. And so when I arrived in Atlanta, it was great to share that with him. So this is a poem by the famous Zen priest Dogen, who was credited with bringing Zen to Japan, or being one of the main figures of bringing Zen from China to Japan. And it was great to find out that Les actually had studied Zen Buddhism quite intensively for many years and knew a lot about it. And yeah, I think many of the things I see in his art and his activities, I feel coming back to this interest in these in the fundamentals of life. And so for that reason, I also want to close with a quote, and actually this is where the moon and the dewdrop comes from. So this is one of the famous images that Dogen used in his poetry. But this is another quote from him, and it's not so much poetry as a manual for how you should live your life. And with Zen Buddhism being not so much a religion as rather a practical philosophy of living. It says, "Do not follow the ideas of others, but learn to listen to the voice within yourself. Your body and mind will become clear, and you will realize the unity of all things." And I think in many ways that encapsulates also Les as a person, and Les as a scientist, as well as a friend and a collaborator, and as a great person to be around with. So, thank you.
I have to say, one story about Roman, since he brought it up with his child and his beautiful wife, and he had his son Liam, and I said, we have to go to Oktoberfest. So we did go drive up to Oktoberfest, which is held in this hokey town in North Georgia. And they had an oompa band, and they had sausages, and Roman looked at me with this really disgusted look on his face and said, "I can't believe my son's first exposure to German culture."